In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at how Blur Studio used Forest Pack to create the incredible bayou environments for the release trailer of Mafia 3. The files used in this video were kindly sent to us by Blur Studios, and due to the use of copyrighted assets, they unfortunately aren't available for download. But this tutorial illustrates a way of working that should be easy to reproduce for anyone. Rather than go step by step through every setting, which will vary anyway from project to project, the focus is on the core principles and features of Forest Pack that Blur used to create the setup. Surprisingly, the setup is simple. The aim was to allow for fast, easy changes to the road so that a large number of shots could be produced in minimal time. Therefore, it was important to keep it simple, and in this tutorial, only 3 areas are needed to control all of the forest objects. Firstly, there's the bayou terrain itself. In this demo file, it's a simple plane, but of course it could be a much more complex model. Secondly, there's a single spline that defines the path for the road, and it's also going to be used to drive several of the forest objects. And finally, there's the road mesh. To create this, Blur used 3ds Max's native loft tool, which creates a surface using 2 splines, one to define the path, and another for the cross section. By using the same spline to drive both Forest Pack and the road geometry, the whole system can be updated really easily. The loft tool also has the benefit of automatically generating UVWs. Using just these 3 components, the environment is populated using several Forest Pack objects. To illustrate, we'll start with the smallest items and work towards the largest. There are going to be in fact 8 forest objects to this setup. 3 are used for pebbles of various sizes, 2 for leaves and debris, and 3 for the surrounding foliage and the trees. That's not to say that 8 is the magic number. You can add more or less depending on your particular needs and concept. This tutorial assumes a basic understanding of Forest Pack, and to save some time, all the Forest Pack objects have already been created and the necessary geometry has been added to the items list. However, no other crucial settings have been entered so that we can explain what we're doing and why. It's always essential to have the right assets, and in the Mafia 3 setup we see an extensive selection of stones, pebbles, grasses, bushes, trees and dead tree trunks culled from Blur's own libraries and several stock sources. A large variety and range of assets will allow you to more accurately reproduce the chaos found in nature and match your reference materials and ecosystem, but even with fewer assets, Forest Pack can create really nice, believable variety simply by randomizing the rotation, scale and materials of objects. To access these 8 Forest Pack objects, the easiest and quickest way is to use Forest Lister. To open it, you click this button from the Forest Pack toolbar, and then these tools will open, allowing you to see and manage all the forest objects from a single panel. You can turn on or off the visibility of forest objects, change the viewport display mode using the drop down menu, or even jump instantly to individual rollouts by clicking on the statistics buttons. It's really an invaluable time saver. So let's start with the smallest item, the pebbles on the road. I find it useful to turn off all of the forest objects except this one in order to see more clearly what I'm doing. And to do this, just grey out the others' light bulb icons. This first object we're going to look at incorporates nearly all of the techniques Blur used for the entire setup, so we'll explore this one in detail and then skip a little more on the others. The first thing you need to do with a scatter is to identify the areas. The stones should only be scattered on the road, which is as simple as selecting it from the surface rollout. Auto update is also enabled so that the scatter updates interactively in the viewports if and when the road path changes. With most of the other settings at their defaults, you'll see an even distribution of stones on the road, but what we really want is to create more stones in the centre and at the edges where they would naturally accumulate. To do this, there's a feature called Scale and Distance Fall Off that enables you to control the density and scale of objects using a curve. These settings are found in the Areas rollout, which you can also quickly access by clicking on the Areas button in Forest Lister. The Fall Off feature is activated by checking the boxes next to Density and/or Scale. The area the Fall Off effect influences is determined by the Include and Exclude distances. These values determine a distance from the perimeter of the area over which a graph function will be evaluated. It's perhaps easier to illustrate if the graph is visible, so to see and edit a fall-off curve, you click the Edit Curve button. To explain this graph, the x-axis represents the distance from the edge, determined by the include value. This road is about 7 meters wide, so if the fall-off needs to go from the middle of the road to the edge, for example, a value of 3.5 meters, which is half the road's width, should be used. The y-axis, on the other hand, represents either density or scale. As you can see, in the default graph settings, the curve linearly descends from left to right, so the density gradually decreases as it approaches the edge. If you edit the include value, you can adjust the range over which this fall-off effect is calculated. By changing the graph, you can get some really interesting effects. So we want the pebbles to be denser in the middle of the road and at the edge where the cars don't normally disturb them. So to do this, you would edit the graph so that it is at 100% or more on the left and the right, and then it dips down in the middle. Here you can see an appropriate curve for this effect. Notice that I'm making the graph steeper in the middle of the road than at the edges, so the fall-off is less pronounced and more abrupt. As well as using fall-off graphs to adjust the density, it's also going to look more believable if you use them to edit the scale too. In that way, you can make sure that those few stones that survive a car's wheels are smaller than those thrown to the sides. To do this, turn on the scale feature and edit the graph so that it is similar to the one I just created. Notice though that the graph at its high point is around 125% and in its lowest point it's only about 55%. You wouldn't really want to reduce the scale down too low or the items would become invisible in the render, in which case you might as well have used the density graph to remove them completely instead, which would be more efficient. Now if we toggle this on and off, we can see how the scatter looks before and after the fall-off effects. That's much more convincing, but it's still a little bit too evenly distributed over the entire road. So to break it up a bit, we do two things: add disabled objects and change the distribution map. Adding disabled objects allows you to randomly remove some of the stones. When this is coupled with Forest Pack's clusters feature, you can remove them in random patches instead of just thinning out the entire distribution. Here's how this works. Firstly, you need to go to the geometry rollout and add a new item. Immediately set this to disabled and you'll see that some of the stones have disappeared. It's possible to control the number of stones that are removed using the item's probability value. The higher this number, the more likely the item will be used. For this setup, Blur used a value of about 25%, so a quarter of the existing stones are removed. This thins out the density. But to get the correct look, it's necessary to remove stones in patches, not individually, and to do this, use clusters, which is found in the distribution rollout. This feature automatically groups together similar objects, which are defined by their colour IDs. For example, in this object there are two types of stone and one disabled item. Each one has a different colour ID, and so each one will be placed in a separate cluster. To enable this setting, just activate the radio button and then set the size of the clusters by eye. Blur used a cluster size of 2.5 meters, but you should feel free to experiment. It's important to note that this feature also respects the probability values we just set, so there will be fewer empty patches than there are stones. You can further control the appearance of the clusters using the roughness and blurry edge parameters. Roughness is used to add some irregularity to the shape of the clusters, and blurry edge allows adjacent clusters to bleed into one another. For this example, a value of 50% works well to erode the well-defined edges and add some chaos to the shapes. Finally, it's also possible to use noise to reintroduce items from the other clusters. With this finished, you can clearly see the empty patches that have been added with this technique, breaking up the regular distribution. To further erode the regularity of the scatter, you can change the distribution itself. In this sample file, Blur used groups 1 to create small clusters of stones instead of an even spread. And finally, if you look closely, there's still a grid that's visible, even in the clusters. To break this up, introduce a random transform on the X and Y axis to each stone. This is achieved using transform translation. A value of -100 to 100% works well, but larger values can be used if necessary. All of the other Forest Pack objects in this scene use similar techniques, but with a few variations so that their distribution is sufficiently varied and chaotic that it looks natural and that the layers relate to one another convincingly. In Blur's setup, a second Forest Pack object adds Asphalt Pebbles, which are slightly larger. Actually, all three of the stone objects share the same geometry, and the size is increased by going to the geometry rollout and changing the global scale. You can also change the randomized scaling if necessary to create a different effect for each layer. The tiny pebbles, for example, used a random scale between 25% and 150%, but in this scatter the objects aren't scaled proportionally. It uses a random scale of 33 to 225% for the XY axis and 15% to 150% on the Z axis. Randomizing these axes separately in this way allows you to create much larger stones with a wider range of sizes without them getting unnaturally tall. So with these settings, you'll end up with wider, flatter stones. If I isolate this layer by disabling the tiny pebbles, you can see that these are also distributed slightly differently. Opening the fall off map reveals why. The curves have been adjusted so that the density is much higher around the centre and the edge of the road and lower everywhere else when compared to the tiny pebbles. Often to create additional layers like this, the easiest way is to simply duplicate the forest pack object and then make some changes. This saves you time because most of the work's already been done. These objects probably share the same scatter area, include distance and more. But you must be careful if you create layers by duplicating forest packs objects because you can end up with scattered items that occupy exactly the same place. This is most obvious if your area, distribution map and density settings remain unchanged. In this object, I've deliberately reset these settings so that they're the same as the first layer to show how easy the issue is to fix. First, you just go to the general rollout and set a new seed value. This will change all the randomized values and help avoid repetition. That helps, but because the distribution map is still the same, there's a risk of items occupying exactly the same space, as we can see here. To fix that, just slightly edit the distribution settings, and the easiest way is to rotate the map. In this case, I'll rotate it by 90 degrees, but any value would do. There's now far less chance of the layers clashing, and instead you retain a shared appearance and gain an interesting visual interaction between these two layers. Finally, on this layer, the cluster features can be modified slightly, again to create different but similar interaction between the layers. To create larger patches which have no medium-sized pebbles, Blur increased the size of the clusters to 5 meters in their setup, but trial and error will give you the result you need. For greater variety, you can also change the shape of each layer, for example by reducing the roughness, blurry edge and noise samples to 25%. With both these layers enabled, we can start to see how the two layers of stone start to build up and complement one another. The third layer adds medium-sized pebbles to the road. Once again, the larger size has been achieved not by scattering different objects, but by going to the geometry rollout, where the global scale has now been increased to 200%. Conversely, the randomized scale for the XY axis is reduced slightly from 33% to 100%, and 15 to 100% for the Z axis. The overall effect is to create larger stones, but with less range between the smallest and the biggest. The stones are then distributed using very similar fall-off curves to the tiny pebbles the first layer. In fact, if you examine the curves for layer 1 and the curves for this layer, you'll see that they're nearly identical. Scale is very similar, and density is only different insofar as there are slightly fewer large stones in the worn part of the road, and a less gentle transition in the middle and at the sides. The distribution map settings are the same, except that the rotation has been increased by another 90 degrees to 120 to avoid objects once again sharing the same location. Cluster size has been reduced to 0.5 meters in this layer, and this results in much smaller empty patches, so the stones are more evenly dispersed along the entire length of the road. With these changes and all three layers turned on, the road's building up nicely. But next up, Blur added large debris to the road. This used a different model, with a global scale of 250%, the largest yet. Scale randomization is set between 25 and 125%, and this time the proportions on the XYZ axis are maintained. Because of their size, we want fewer of them, far fewer, and so in the distribution rollout the map type is changed to very scattered, and the density is increased significantly to 33 meters. Now there's only a very occasional rock scattered along the road. Diversity clusters is not necessary for this scatter because it's already so sparse, but we still don't want these large rocks destroying tyres, so the density curve is drawn to remove them completely from the worn areas. You can see where the curve touches the bottom in this graph, the density is reduced to 0. With this done, very few debris models are added, just enough to add a bit of interest. You can see them in this screenshot if I change the object colour to red. The road is flanked by trees, so we'd expect to see some leaves. These are added in a fifth layer. Inspecting the items list, as well as the leaf geometry you'd expect, we also have once again a disabled item to create more realistic and uneven distribution. To create more spaces, more gaps than leaves, the leaf items probabilities are reduced to 25%. while the disabled item is left at 100. As we've already seen, these probability settings work in tandem with the distribution clusters feature. By turning this on and setting the size to 3.5 meters, a nice randomness is achieved. We also need far fewer leaves. This road is used relatively regularly, so we only want a smattering, enough for a recent fall. The distribution settings should therefore reflect this, and the distribution map used here is spread 1, which is much more sparse. Density is also increased to remove even more leaves. By now you should be familiar with the density curve, which is similar to the others we've already seen. Just like the other layers, the leaves should be excluded from the area of road most frequently driven on. This road is surrounded by grass, but some will also propagate in the natural mulch that collects at the edges. To simulate this, a 6th layer adds grass just to the very edges of the road, which has the added benefit of hiding the transition between the road and the surrounding ground geometry. Examining the geometry list reveals there are a number of different grass models used. The composition of the grass is once again controlled by adjusting the probability values of the items, and by looking at these we can see that the main ingredient is a typical lawn grass, with the rest made of a mixture of small plants and weeds. To ensure that the plants only grow on the very edge of the road, the density curve spikes only on the far right hand side of the graph. The ramped increase allows the grass to gradually but rapidly reduce in number in the first third of the road's width. A nearly identical graph is used for the scale fall off so that the plants reduce in size as well as thinning out. Distribution is also pretty straightforward, a fairly sparse map with a 10 meter density setting. I can't emphasize enough that these values work for this project. You should adjust your density settings to get the effect that you want. The beauty of Forest Pack's point cloud mode though is that you can quite easily preview this in the viewports to help you towards your best settings. The 6 layers we've added so far are applied directly to the road geometry. The remaining 2 layers are used to create the foliage on the surrounding landscape and should be scattered on the terrain geometry. To do this, you go to the surface rollout, click plus and select the environment geometry. If your terrain also runs under your road, as in this case, you will need to remove scattered items from this area. Thankfully, as we've already seen, this road is driven by a single spline, and we can reuse this to exclude the grass. To do this, in the areas rollout, the road spline is added to the areas list. Open splines like this can be used with Forest Pack, but because they have no dimension on the y-axis, it has to be set manually in Forest Pack using the thickness property. This road is about 7 meters wide, but it's good to have a bit of overlap, so a value of 3 meters works well for this scene. We also would like the density to fall off slightly. This is a simple linear fall off, so the curve can be left at the default and a small exclude value is used. This will help the grass to blend with the existing scatter at the edge of the road. Note that this time we use the exclude value instead of include because the spline clearing the grass from the road is removing scattered items. In some styles it's possible and desirable to use include and exclude fall off simultaneously. So the distribution settings for the grass are also pretty straightforward. Once again, the spread 1 map is used with a 10 meter density setting, the same as the edges. The clusters feature is also used in this case, but this time as it was originally intended to group together plants of the same type. This mimics the way plants often disperse in nature, with plants of a similar type growing close to one another. Often it's easier to see this clustering effect if you go to the display rollout and turn on Use Color ID. This tints the point cloud with the same colours set in the geometry items list and helps you to visualise the effects of clustering. And then finally we get to the last forest object, which adds the trees to the sides of the road. If you needed to fill the entire terrain with trees, for example if your road was in a forest, then you could use the same technique as we just explored for the grass. In this case though, the trees are only on the sides of the road extending into the swamp a short distance. To create this effect, the landscape geometry is added to the surfaces rollout, as before, but this time in the areas rollout the surface is turned off. This means that the surface itself doesn't generate any scattered objects, but it is still used to calculate the scattered items' position on the Z-axis when they're created using another overlapping area. To define the actual area of the scatter, the road spline is used again, and because it's being used this time to add trees, the default include setting is retained. The thickness value determines how far either side of the road the tree should extend, a value of 25 meters working well in this sample file. Which is okay, but just like before, the trees are on the road. To exclude them, you add the same spline a second time, this time changing the mode to exclude and increasing the thickness value until the trees are removed the correct distance. Otherwise, the rest of the tree setup is pretty straightforward. Transform randomization is left more or less at the defaults, and no clustering or fall-off features are used for this object. And that completes this road setup. By turning on each object, we can see how each part contributes. So here we have the base. Now we have tiny pebbles, small asphalt pebbles, medium pebbles and dirt, the large debris, just a couple of those, some leaves, the grass at the sides of the road, the grass on the environment, and then finally the trees. And the best thing is the whole thing is driven by a single spline. We can learn many valuable lessons from Blur that can be applied to a lot of our projects, including the importance of fall-off curves, how to add complexity with layers, the time-saving potential and flexibility of creating parametric rigs, and how small changes to probability, distribution and settings and clusters can yield big rewards. A huge thanks to Blur for allowing us to share their workflow, and we hope that you enjoyed this case study. Until next time, if you'd like more information about curves and everything else that we've looked at in this tutorial, please see our reference section, or for more training, please see the tutorials page, and stay tuned for more episodes soon.